All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Network 2020's virtual event on Scrap or Salvage, the Future of the International Liberal World Order. We are going to start to dive right in today. I know there are still people who are jumping on, but we have a lot of ground to cover. This is a big conversation, so we want to spend as much time on it as possible. So with that, just a brief, some brief introductions. My name is Courtney Doggart. I'm the president of Network 2020. We are a New York-based nonprofit that focuses on bridging the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy worlds. And we're really looking for innovative solutions to foreign policy challenges. And we do that through bringing on top experts to talk about critical problems in the world. And we also run research trips abroad and conduct programs of our own that help address some of those issues. So with that, we are going to introduce our panelists. I am going to not give their bios justice. Fortunately, there are some key points up on the screen, but all of them have extensive experience. We have Dr. Stewart Patrick, who joins us from the Council on Foreign Relations, where he is a senior fellow in global governance and director of the International Institutions and Global Governance Program. He has a lot of experience in multilateral cooperation and global issues with a real focus on international institutions. And he has government experience as well and has looked at multilateralism and through the lens of a lot of different issues, including refugees, migration, global health, and law enforcement. Among others, he, as you can see, has 2 master's degrees and a doctorate in international relations and is very well experienced. So, and then we also have Dr. Kori Schake, who is the Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. She also has a distinguished career in government. She's worked at the State Department, Department of Defense, and the National Security Council at the White House. She's also taught extensively and is the author of several books, and one of them in particular is very relevant today, and that is, Can the Liberal World Order Be Saved? So we're very much looking forward to hearing from her. And our last panelist is Professor John Ikenberry. And this is one for whom, as a student of international relations, I remember sitting in my classroom at Columbia and reading one of your articles in our foundational tome of international affairs. And so it's a real pleasure that you're joining us today. It's sort of the rock star of international affairs. So, and he is the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. He is ranked 10th in scholars who have produced the best work in the field of international relations in the past 20 years, and is the author of numerous books and is really focused on this topic in particular in terms of the liberal world order. So to be able to hear from him is such an honor today. And moderating the conversation is Dr. Joanna Wojciechowski, who is a Network 2020 member for a long time. And she also participated in one of Network 2020's research programs to Poland in 2004 and was an author of the subsequent report, Poland Beyond Solidarity. She also brings a lot of experience working in government policy advocacy, working at NGOs and in think tanks. And has also worked with the World Affairs Councils of America. I'm going to wrap it up there with the bios because I want to leave time for conversations, but really quickly, we're running by popular demand. Thanks to all of you who have filled out polls at the end of our discussions. We will be running a post-event discussion group. So the first time we're trying it, it'll be about 15 minutes after this event. If you're interested, what will happen at the end of the session is there will be a slide that has a QR code, and Brian will also put a link in the chat box. And so if you click on that link, you'll be taken to a new Zoom call. It will take a few minutes for us to wrap up this call and then get onto that one. So this will happen all at the very end. But this is just a 15-minute opportunity for us to break out into small groups and talk about what we heard. So we're really excited. I hope you'll be able to take the time to join us. It's a really wonderful opportunity to make this go beyond a webinar format and give us the opportunity to engage. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to you, Joanna.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Courtney. It is my great pleasure to moderate today's discussion with 3 prominent experts on the subject of the current state of the relationship between the United States and the global order. So I would like to begin with a question for all three of you. Given where we are currently, where do you envision the international liberal order moving towards? I thought I'd start with an easy question. So Dr. Patrick, would you like to start first?
Sure. I think maybe I begin really quickly by just saying what I consider the the liberal international order actually is, and then talk about that. I mean, it's basically an open rules-based system that's founded on shared multilateral institutions, norms, principles, and laws, basically, that are designed to permit independent countries to achieve shared security and prosperity, tackle common challenges, and not least advance the cause of freedom. I think that's basically been what it is. Now, a lot of people have said that the liberal international order have challenged whether or not it's actually a real thing. A lot of people have said it's a myth. Hasn't been particularly liberal in a lot of places. Hasn't always been international in terms of, it's always had its core in the West, and outside of the West in particular, it hasn't been particularly orderly. But I think that we can all agree that while there's some truth in some of these critiques, there has been this conscious effort, beginning in the 19th century under Britain and, then the United States now, to try to advance these liberal principles and a rule-bound international order. And in my view, the liberal international order, though, is in crisis, both because and we can talk about some of the both domestic and international crises that it faces, but it's only going to survive if it becomes more of a shared enterprise and not so dominated by the United States. There has to be a shared leadership involving a broader coalition of predominantly Western, I would say, countries at the core of it. That's the first thing, but it also needs to be proved that it's actually capable of resolving some of the most pressing problems that face societies in our age of globalization. I think that a lot of people around the world don't believe that it's actually capable of providing the things that really it was supposed to do: prosperity, security, and also a sense of national identity. And I think that the liberal international order needs to show that, or the champions of it need to show that citizens, that democracy, external openness, and international cooperation and a set of common rules can actually advance their interests better than nativism, protectionism, isolationism, and authoritarianism. And there's the liberal international order is up for grabs right now. I think Joe Biden's election helps it, and we can talk more about that. But there's a lot of work to be done, and it can't, particularly after the Trump years.
All right, thank you. Dr. Schake?
So I think my prediction is that the liberal international order will not only continue to be the defining framework, but that it will be strengthened and deepened because of the nature of the challenges we're facing. I disagree a little bit with Stewart Patrick about the success of the liberal international order. If you compare the contemporary world to the world of 1945, people are safer, they are more prosperous, they are less likely to die either by depredations from their own government, because representative governments have increased in number, but also internationally, because the liberal international order has actually made the international order safer for people and for countries. My sense is that the pandemic and the experience of the United States retreating from global leadership are democratizing its power structures. Which, again, I disagree only just slightly on the margin with Dr. Patrick. I'm an enormous fan of his work. I learn a lot about how to make the international order better from his work on international institutions. But I do also think that the climate crisis and the pandemic are reminding all of us that what the liberal international order gives us is strategic depth. It gives us the ability to solve problems where they are emerging before they become roaring wildfires in our own population or on our own territory. And the value of that, I think, has been amply demonstrated. So I think you're likely to see more concerted efforts And not just because you have a Biden administration elected in the United States, but because we're seeing what the world looks like when we don't do that.
All right, thank you. And then now, Professor Ikenberry, you've recently written a book on this subject. So
Yes.
I'm sure
I'll
we'd
try
like
not to
get.
give you all the arguments in this first intervention, but I basically agree with both of my colleagues. I think the 21st century is going to need more, not less, liberal internationalism, which is a way of thinking about and acting in the world built around cooperative organization of international order to solve problems based on a kind of coalition of liberal democracies who have unusual values and capacities for incubating and leading this kind of order. It's fallen into difficult times. The liberal international order now, American elites, other liberal international elites have found themselves struggling with solving problems and showing the functionality and virtues of this order. But I think we're in a period where the alternatives have now shown themselves, and we're kind of horrified by them. And some of these alternatives have just literally in the last day left the stage, and we are back to what I think will be a period of a cycle really of history where we reimagine, rebuild, and redefend the liberal international order. And let me just say that we forget, I think, that so much of the world that we've grown up in and taken for granted really is marked by this liberal international logic. We've done a great deal to make the modern world more safe and prosperous, a glimmer of social justice, because we found a way to build institutions, global, regional, economic, security, political, around these kind of cooperative relationships. The framework that is up for grabs today is a framework that has done so much over the last 75 years, opening up the world economy, creating multilateral and intergovernmental capacities to solve problems that governments and people care about, integrating and reintegrating Germany and Japan into the world system as civilian great powers, collaborators in a coalitional world system, finding a platform for Europe to reinvent itself, with Germany and France finding a way to launch a European project. And finally, a kind of platform for new countries that are making transitions to democracy and market reform to have a kind of a club of well-wishers who can work with them in their transition. So I think all of these features have been playing out over 75 years. And in some sense, if this order didn't exist, it would have to be invented. And so today, I think it has to be reinvented. And we'll talk more about that as we go on today. But I think the underlying rationale for liberal international order is that in an age of rising economic insecurity and environmental interdependence, we can't be secure alone. We can only be secure together. And liberal internationalism, let me just say that liberal internationalism is the only vision of international order that allows you to get there. There isn't one coming from authoritarian states in Eastern Europe or from China. It's kind of the only game in town if you see as the central problem the management of interdependence under our 21st century conditions that we see ahead of us.
Thank you. So yes, it seems like you all agree there is this interdependence and this need to have an international liberal order. So my question to all of you is then, what are the greatest challenges for that order, and what are some possible alternatives that could develop? So let me start with you, Dr. Schake.
Okay, so the alternatives to the liberal order are two. One is chaos, that is no order, and the other is a less liberal order. if you think, for example, of what a Chinese-dominated international order would look like, it's probably not one fostering to individual liberty and human rights, as the million Chinese Uyghur who are currently in re-education camps could attest. And so if we let the liberal order slip out of our grasp, first of all, it's very difficult to reconstitute. And second of all, the greater likelihood is, instead of reconstituting it, you will have states feeling too weak and too isolated to be able to cooperate. That has tended to be the nature of the international system. You either, in eras gone by, one of the things that my work on hegemonic transition, on the transition between a dominant, powerful state and a successor state, demonstrates is that the way a government behaves domestically is the best guide for how a government will behave internationally, right? So for free societies, for the so-called Western governments, which include South Korea, Australia, Japan, and others, they believe people have rights, and they loan them in limited ways for agreed purposes to governments. And that's how you get a liberal international order. You get it with the ascendancy of those states after 1945 being able to control a large part of the globe. If you allow that to slip from your grasp, you're going to have one of these two alternatives: a less liberal order or a more chaotic international order. And neither of those are good for the security or the prosperity of the United States or other like-minded countries.
All right, thank you. And Professor Ikenberry?
Well, I think I agree with that. I think the challenge of reinvigorating the liberal international order really needs to focus on reconnecting international activities that liberal democracies and other states engage in for mutual benefit to the everyday lives of everyday people. I think the heyday of liberal international order, the post-war period that we've been talking about, was one, at least in the early decades during the Cold War and to some extent after, where the international system that people looked out at from their domestic position was doing good things for them. It was stabilizing the world economy. It was creating capacities for their governments to make good on their expanding commitments to post-war industrial societies, to provide for security and safe social safety net, and reinvigorate the social contract. And that in various ways has been lost or attenuated in the last few decades, as internationalism looks more like an activity of bankers and businessmen to have a platform for doing deals, and less about providing security and support for middle-class Americans and Europeans and other people in other societies. So reimagining and reconnecting our internationalism to our domestic societies is a very important activity, I think, that should be kind of at the cutting edge of our efforts at rebuilding and renewing. In my book, looking at this project of building and rebuilding and reinventing liberal order over 2 centuries, at every moment when there was a kind of golden era internationally of liberal internationalism, there was a associated domestic movement, you might say. Think of the progressive period or the New Deal period, where there was a complementary effort at home to rebuild our societies inside our countries. And so I think those two things need to go together. And I do have some hope that that's on the agenda of of our leaders today. Certainly, the new American president seems to get that to his very bones. So I'm optimistic that the ideas there about how to move forward.
All right, thank you. And then Dr. Patrick.
Thank you very much. You know, I am optimistic about the ability of the liberal international order to overcome crises, and I think also the failure of alternatives. Well, let me just say a little bit about the crises. I think probably it's an internal crisis. I think obviously we've seen the fragility of democracy, and while Kori is right that you know, we've seen a growing number of democracies certainly since 1945. You know, according to the Freedom House, you know, this is the 14th or 15th year of democratic recession around the world. And so we, you know, there are major challenges, and you know, it's exacerbated by the fragmentation of reality in the digital age. And we have doubts or crises at the core of American democracy. Now, this may be a prelude for renewal, right? But it's when you have people living in totally different political realities, that's a serious problem. In terms of the external challenges, you know, it's not just a rise of geopolitical competition where, you know, it's about the distribution of benefits you get from, you know, being a big power. It's really about fundamental divergence in classing world order visions and disagreements over norms and rules that should govern state behavior, from commerce to cyberspace to outer space to development cooperation, right? So you do have this clash. Now, I wrote a piece a couple of years ago, the world order is starting to crack. What could replace the liberal international order? And I went through a number of different alternatives. You know, one of them, which we sort of got a little bit, was a retreat to Fortress America, right? Presuming there's a successor to Trump, one could imagine that a little bit. Spheres of influence is another one. You have some movement towards regionalism. It's exacerbated by the fact that the U.S. was AWOL for much of the last 4 years, not least in China, in terms of, and you see that in the Chinese Regional Comprehensive Economic Program for Asia, mostly Asia Pacific, whereas the United States has been AWOL from that since we left the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Another alternative is a concert system, right? You could imagine that you get to some shallow version of the 19th century where great powers sort of agree on a number of fundamental rules. They don't care at all about domestic regime type, which is an important part of the liberal international order. And so, you know, you could imagine that. It's kind of a cynical, transactional, but it's just a great power thing. You know, the opposite of that is, you know, what you could call a league of their own, right? You know, it's a alliance of democracies. Joe Biden wants to hold a democracy summit, right? And there are some good things about it, but there's some pitfalls too, because you may divide the world up into democracies and non-democracies. You know, I think the most realistic is what I would call sort of a la carte world, which is basically, you know, we're not a G20 world, not a G2 world, not a G7 world, but sort of a GX world, which recognizes the United States plays on multiple chessboards. And the core of the liberal international order, just to get back to you know, what both Kori and John have said, is going to be U.S. and like-minded democracies. And you start from that core, but then you realize you don't want to get into a Cold War with these other guys, because you actually need their help in climate change and nuclear nonproliferation and a slew of other international issues that just can't be, you know, solved in a cozy Western boardroom, I guess I would say. Thanks.
All right, thank you. So there are two factors, two disruptors, the great powers of China and Russia, to the system. They have been actively acting in the international arena to undermine really US predominance. So my question is, how should the international liberal order handle those two countries? And is it to somehow try to incorporate them, offset their influence? What do you think? If I could start with you, Professor Ikenberry.
That's what, in some ways, the big question of our time. And liberal internationalists have answered that question over the decades and centuries in almost every conceivable way, to try to incorporate and socialize, to try to intervene and overturn, to seek sort of mutual coexistence. I think during the early post-Cold War period, there was a real hope, kind of a more hope than a theory behind it, if you will, that the order would expand out and countries would, including China and Russia, would find a place in it and move up inside of it as so many other countries have. China is in some sense in a position where it's too big to be simply swallowed up inside of the liberal order and not big enough to really build an alternative. So it's kind of in and out. And I think we're kind of stuck with that. I don't think China can be an entirely fundamentally defined adversary. We need China as a cooperative partner on all sorts of global issues, but they are going to be antagonistic to many of the features of the order that we want to build and live in. There are differences, and there will be a competition, a kind of competition that I hope will drive each party in the name of leadership to try to build order that solves problems, a kind of tournament of accomplishment or problem solving. If China can try to build its leadership around its own efforts at solving problems, may the force be with it. But the US and the liberal democracies should try to do the same thing. And they have different values and orientations that will lead them in different directions. And so I think you have to kind of answer your question, you have to be able to walk and chew gum. You have to be able to work with your like-minded partners to do things that China doesn't want you to do. You want to defend human rights. You have your own view about labor rights and environment and things that you want to build into your international order. We'll call them social purposes that China doesn't agree with. So you have to, in some sense, envisage an order where there is an inside and an outside. But at the same time, in a global era, we have to also build an international order that allows the strongest states in the world to pursue their enlightened self-interest, to collaborate on problems where the problems are not zero sum. Will we gain or will they gain, but will humanity survive? Starting with global warming, health pandemics, as we've seen. And then thirdly, the third great fear, of course, is proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Those three 21st century threats are threats to humanity, to human civilization. And we all have to be on the same side in fighting the wars against those threats. So I think we have to be able to have an architecture that allows us to do different things and protect different interests and values simultaneously.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Patrick?
Yeah, I'll make this very quick, since I am in violent agreement with much of what John just said. But yeah, I think we need to learn to compartmentalize. We got to be careful not to go whole hog in a new Cold War. We need to think of in terms of concentric circles against, again, a core of OECD nations, which by and large are aligned on many, although not all issues like digital privacy, still trying to sort of work that one out with our European friends. Outside of that, we need China and others, Russia and others to cooperate on certain common issues. Underscoring, John mentioned WMD and pandemics, and then climate change, even related to climate change, just frankly the integrity of the biosphere, on which international relations doesn't really tend to deal with that topic. But if we don't have a sustainable planet to actually do our competition or cooperation in, we're all going to be in big trouble. But I think that there are areas also where we need to push back, obviously, selectively against China in terms of regional ambitions, in terms of throwing its weight around too much. We need to forcefully defend our own values in terms of human rights and democracy. But I think there are areas where trust and confidence building mechanisms can certainly help, particularly in the area of arms control, cyberspace, and also outer space, which are all realms where there are significant dangers if we don't try to restrain our competitive instincts. Thanks.
All right, thank you. And then Dr. Schake, your view, especially Russia and China and the alliances, our defensive alliances that we have. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think we are not worried enough about a failing China. Where our frame of reference is that China is stampeding towards global dominance, and the economic data doesn't actually bear that out. They have ceased the changes to their economic rulemaking that have propelled their prosperity. It's entirely possible that Russia and China should be in the same category, not as great powers, but as malevolent declining powers. And that's a different kind of challenge for the liberal international order than the challenge of a rising China. So I guess my first point is we should be worried about both those things, because there are leading indicators that in fact we may have a different kind of China problem than we thought. The second is we certainly shouldn't underestimate the difficulty. I think, John, I don't mean this as a criticism, but you did made it sound a little bit like all of us have the same view on these three big international problems. And you know, China's view on the global climate crisis is, you rich countries solved it. If you want our help, give us for free the technology that will allow us to, right? And on non-proliferation, a whole lot of other countries think that the hypocrisy of the nuclear weapons possessor states makes ridiculous their call for prohibiting proliferation. So, and by the way, those views have legitimacy. The genius of the international order is that it gives a means for the kinds of compromises that we see domestically, making democratic states better problem solvers and more stable over time than the alternatives. So it's the process as much as anything else that makes the liberal international order preferable to its alternatives, because these are hard compromises to find the basis for.
Right. Well, thank you so much. And I think now we will turn to some questions from our participants. And one question, it's very basic, is the term liberalism. It has one meaning in the United States and different meanings in much of Europe and the rest of the world. So how do you each perceive the term liberalism? What do you mean by that term? So whoever would like to start first.
John, I feel like this is your wheelhouse, my friend.
Well, I do have some things to say about that. And in my book, one of the things that I note is that in the long tradition of liberal internationalism, which is again a tradition of thinking and acting in the world that sits alongside realism, Marxism, other great traditions. It's like these other traditions, very heterogeneous. There are lots of different subgroups and movements. There are neoliberals and neoconservatives, and there are classical liberals and social democratic liberals. It means a different thing in the 19th century than the 20th century in Europe, as you say, than it does in the United States. But as it relates to the international order, I define liberal international order as open, rule-based, and loosely progressive, or organized around progressive social purposes. That is to say, it's open as opposed to built around blocks or imperial spheres. It's rule-based in that the multilateralism is at least partially based on principles divorced from particular power concentrations. And there's a social purpose about cooperation that moves societies forward. Liberal international order does get confusing because it does have two different meanings in the way it's been used in the popular vernacular. One is it's a liberal order because it's built around liberal principles: openness, rule of law, transparency, reciprocity. But liberal international order also means the order built by liberal democracies, which may have features that are not liberal, like the alliance system, which there's nothing liberal. You you could be an autocratic state and have alliances. So alliances themselves are not do not necessarily have liberal properties, but they are part of the political formation of something we call the liberal order. And I just say, let's don't sweat the definition. I think what has occurred in the last decade or so is that there's a sense that something special about the international order occurred in the second half of the 20th century that was different from the old orders of the past. It wasn't a balance of power system. It wasn't an imperial system. It's built on a more negotiated, collaborative, multilateral basis. And it was kind of a confluence of different forces that generated it. And it's something that might be worth protecting. And so we need a label for it. And so there's been a kind of effort to give it some solidity as something that the world produced so that we can defend it, or if we can't defend it, we can understand what era we've just passed through. So I think that's why we keep coming back to this term.
If I could just say, just really quickly, I think just to pick up on what John said, I think that the two dimensions is an interesting question. How tightly linked are, in a sense, international regimes to domestic regime type? And I think that's something that is probably under continuous negotiation. You're always going to get something that is a little bit more liberal internationalist if it's about members of, for instance, the OECD, versus if you have a broader, more universal system like the United Nations, which obviously welcomes in. It's a liberal internationalist in many respects, but it, on the other hand, of course, welcomes in any country, regardless of its authoritarian structure.
Okay, thank you. Anything from you, Dr. Schake? No? All right, that's fine. Another question here. As we understand, the United States has always been kind of the leading role in the order. And so a question is, has the United States lost the moral high ground in leading the way for advocating for representative democracy and human rights? Especially, I might add, in the last 4 years.
So, yes, we have. And it's not the first time we have, right? You know, I think the United States can wear our bruises and our failures and still argue internationally that it's important for us to be better, and it's important for everybody else to be better too. That, you know, the United States was a great advocate for democracy in the 1950s when Black Americans couldn't safely vote in our own country. And it mattered that we were an international advocate for democracy, and that advocacy brought the moral responsibility on us to be better as well. And so, yes, we're a failed example. Yes, our loss of stature and moral authority is important, but it's also important to regain it. And it's also important to say that the struggle makes us different and better than governments that aren't even trying.
Okay. All right.
I would strongly agree, just briefly, with what Kori just said. I mean, I read something this week in World Politics Review, which was basically saying on Biden's democracy summit, right, or summit for democracy, I said he should still go ahead with it, but go ahead with it in a sense of humility. Go ahead with it that, wow, democracy is fragile. We're all struggling. We are works in progress. But the fact is that we are democracies means that we can progress. Just as Kori said, I think that's enormously important.
Yeah, I think as we kind of move away from this past 4 years, it will be a story not of the American failure of democracy, but of a kind of American success at hanging on during its worst stress test. The institutions have done some work. This is what Hamilton and Madison had in mind when they designed these institutions. And the brilliant insight was that there will be despots and tyrants, wannabes who will occupy important offices, and you've got to be able to counterbalance and overcome and vote, in our case, vote out those who might wish our institutions ill. And that story of renewal and of coming back and is in some sense a more morally honest and inspiring message than we found the perfect solution to governance and everybody needs to live up to us. It's a more world weary view that we're always working on it. These institutions are fragile, and we don't have a monopoly of insight. And we, as liberal democracies, have values we want to preserve, and we are more likely to do so if we work together and collaborate and find collective solutions to our problems. And that's a very powerful narrative that I think is what will guide us in this next period.
All right, thank you. And Dr. Patrick, actually, I wanted to follow up with you about the Summit of Democracies. You recently wrote in a column that there has been some discussion about is more important for the democracies to focus on their internal problems first, make that a priority rather than having President Biden calling for the democracies to meet now. Would you like to discuss that?
Yeah, just to pick up on what I was starting to say is that, I think that the sheen is off American exceptionalism, right? I'm not saying I don't think that has to turn around and be a wholesale condemnation of the United States. I just think that there's no question that we've been tarnished. Our reputation has taken a beating internationally. I think how we respond to that and how we actually have an acknowledgement and sort of an after-action review of what has gone wrong and the degree to which we can actually try to find common ground is going to be extraordinarily important because, as I said, I think we live in different political universes, and those divisions may go away, hopefully will go away in terms of the sort of sense of reality and the legitimacy of, for instance, Joe Biden's election. There have been a lot of people saying, the Summit for Democracies is a mistake, partly because you start making it starts with the guest list. Who do you invite? There are a lot of problematic democracies out there, incomplete, partial democracies out there. Who sets the agenda? Are you going to bring in a bunch of spoilers, et cetera? But most of the criticism has been on whether or not the United States has the credibility to speak. I think if we approach it from the position of, we're all living in glass houses here, and what are some of the common threats that we face, particularly, a really corrosive information environment, among others. How do we? But there are shared problems that I think that we face. I think to use what the saying that John said, in another context, I think we can chew gum, walk and chew gum at the same time. I think we can honestly look at internal stresses that are common to all pluralistic democracies, and at the same time reaffirm that these are universal principles that we would like to see everywhere. Now, how one goes about doing democracy promotion, the degree that you put pressure on other countries, the nature of that pressure, how coercive it is, et cetera. I think those are all subjects for debate. But I think that the last thing we should do is abandon at least the promotion of the democratic ideal and human rights abroad.
All right, thank you. And then this question for Dr. Schake. Are you worried that the US-China relationship could ever deteriorate into actual military conflict?
Yes, I very much am. Because the aggressive way China is trying to change the rules in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, the way they are preying on the international rights of the Philippines, Vietnam, other regional neighbors, is really dangerous and destabilizing. And they should stop doing it if they want to be seen as a responsible member of the international order. China claims it's a big believer in upholding international law. And yet when the Philippines submitted a dispute over China in its territorial waters for international arbitration, and the International Panel in The Hague supported the Philippines, China claims they have no authority over it. So they only follow the rules of international order when they are advantageous to them. And so they're a danger. And the United States is committed both under the current administration and under a whole bunch of previous ones to the independence of Taiwan, to the rule of law, to, one of the beautiful ironies of American dominance of the international order is that we were the progenitors of the UN Commission on Laws of the Sea. And we signed the pact. We did not submit it for ratification. Stewart, correct me, this was since the early 1970s or something. And yet we enforce its provisions against China, which is a participant in the regime, but is violating it and in ways predatory to China's neighbors. So yeah, we should be concerned about it, because what China wants to do is have impunity to break the rules and endanger the rights of its neighbors. And the United States is committed to supporting those countries and supporting the international order in the process.
All right, thank you. And then this is a question, I think, for Professor Ikenberry, is how can the international order be reinvigorated?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think there is the theme of there's good stuff to come, which we've been, I think all three of the panelists have been, we're all kind of rooting for a reinvigorated, liberal-oriented world system. So we're all kind of thinking in those terms. I guess what I would emphasize is the need to rebuild the coalition of states that want to provide leadership. I think gone are the days where it was an Anglo-American affair, or where it was an Atlantic, US-Europe affair, even a G7 affair. I think we're at a point where there are new stakeholders and with slightly different views of what a proper functioning international order should look like. But I'm thinking of other countries that are interested in supporting a liberal-oriented international order, a multilateral, cooperative one that upholds the kind of values we're talking about today. The middle states, Australia, Canada, South Korea is a wonderful example of a country that is, global Korea. It's not just about North Korea. Their foreign policy is about building bridges across North and South and Asia and the West. And there's a extraordinary energy that I feel in looking around the world today in a kind of multilateral, collaborative agenda for the next iteration of world order. The Alliance for Multilateralism, I believe, launched in 2019 by several European leaders. I heard the South Korean foreign minister speak eloquently about this coalition. India, I think there's extraordinary kind of energy at the level right below the great powers. So I think that kind of reassociation or rebuilding of the coalitions is where I would start. And I think this meeting that Biden has proposed is actually properly framed, a good way of doing that. I do think that a kind of core group of countries that are comfortable working together to drive the reform agenda, reforming the WHO, reforming the world trade rules. I think there's a lot of work to do, and you need countries that can roll up their sleeves and work hand to hand outside of the kind of pressures of geopolitical competition. And I think there is that kind of coalition out there that can provide the new era of leadership.
There's another question regarding what is the role of India? What do you see as the role of India in the new order?
I'll take a swing at that one.
Okay.
Because it's an interesting example of the self-defeating nature of China's foreign policy. Because India has long treasured this sense of itself as a non-aligned country. And while that once had a meaning in a Cold War context, I think they were eminently winnable as a balancing state for China. And opposing American militarization of many of these international problems, and aligning with China as a developing country in setting rules. I think you saw, I defer to Stewart's expertise, but I think you saw during the Paris Climate Accords negotiations, a lot of solidarity between India and China about what the developed world owes the developing world as we solve this problem. And yet, China's attack on India in the last 6 months has really shifted the Indian government's perspective on the kind of international order that they want. And the depth of their participation in the Quad with Australia, Japan, and the United States, the way they have partnered with Japan to create alternative investment vehicles to the Belt and Road Initiative, vehicles that have greater transparency and meet labor and other standards that the opaqueness of the BRI contracts doesn't permit. China has actually pushed India into much greater alignment with the United States and its allies. But again, I would defer to Dr. Patrick, who's more knowledgeable about this than I.
I'm not sure about that, Craig, because that hit a lot of great points. I would say, there's a war going on. I mean, in the heads of, in the minds, I think, of many Indians as to whether or not, how much they're ready to totally, dismiss or abandon the sort of non-aligned mindset that they've had for a long time. But there's no question that China is doing a really good job of getting them to do so. I think one of the things that you'll see in the new administration is probably some continuity with the notion at least of the Indo-Pacific, right, and a centrality of India in a lot of U.S. strategy towards Asia that hasn't been there in before the Trump administration. Anyway, I do think that the one cautionary note I would make is that India is also obviously the world's largest democracy, a very complicated, boisterous democracy. Under the current administration of Narendra Modi and the BJP, there are worrisome signs of just such an embrace of Hindu nationalism that it could undermine the ability of India to play the role that we would like to see as a champion of the liberal international order, at least in its domestic component. That's the only cautionary note that I would say. But other than that, I agree.
All right, great. And this actually is a question probably for you, Dr. Patrick, but open to the rest of the panelists. What is the role, what should the role of the Security Council be, and the idea of getting rid of the P5?
The Security Council remains, for all of its flaws and all of its obstructionism, the fundamental entity that has a monopoly really on decisions on the use of force, in particular, under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, authorizing or legitimating, or at least legalizing, I should say, the use of force and enforcement action. Getting rid of the veto is not really something that is going to be on the cards. When the United Nations was being formed, a couple of senators said to Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, well, what's this veto? We can't have this veto because isn't that a discrimination against the smaller powers? And he said the United States would not stay in the United Nations for 1 second without the veto. And that's not going anywhere under any administration. There could conceivably be efforts to try to limit the veto and use of the veto. There have been discussions about doing so in situations of mass atrocities, for instance, but I think it's highly unrealistic I wrote 10 years ago, co-authored a report for the Council on Foreign Relations on expanding the Security Council and actually U.S. interest in enlarging the Security Council at a moment of where the United States still has a lot of weight, and perhaps we could get in some countries that at least sometimes would agree with us, including other democracies. That's another issue where I think I don't imagine that the current administration is going to spend much time on that agenda, because it's such a dilemma. But it, like getting rid of the veto, I think, are things that make sense in some quarters, but I think are fundamentally unrealistic.
Right. Anybody else want to weigh in? No.
Can't improve on that.
Okay. All right. Very good. And this will probably be our final question. The history of the international liberal order has seen its ups and downs, yet countries still pursue it despite what some see as the anarchical nature, of the world. What are your thoughts about that?
Could you repeat that again? Sorry.
Sure. The history of the international liberal order has seen its ups and downs, yet the countries still pursue this notion of creating a good functioning order. So despite the anarchical nature of global order, what are your thoughts about that?
So I'll take a swing at that. Governments have limits on their time and attention, and they have urgent problems to solve for their own countries. So that they bother to try and create an international order along these lines should tell you that they fear the alternatives. And they're right to fear the alternatives, because an illiberal order will reduce prosperity and make conflict more likely. And anarchy will also reduce prosperity and will also make conflict more likely. So the fact that so many states urgently want the United States to return to being a tiresome, scolding liberal hegemon tells you how fearful they are about the alternatives, and they are right to be fearful.
I'll jump in as well. I agree with that totally. I think there are the reason why countries continue to come back and try to rebuild and rethink and reimagine the liberal order is because there is a kind of set of convictions that are quite deeply rooted in the rise of liberal democracies in the modern era. And those are that trade and open exchange between societies is mutually beneficial, properly managed. Secondly, that international institutions facilitate cooperation. Thirdly, that liberal democracies have unusual and special capacities and interests in cooperation and building a protective or supportive international order. And then fourthly, under conditions of rising economic, security, and environmental cooperation, collaborative relations are utterly essential, that you're more likely to be secure together, working together, than working alone. And so those are convictions that we can see migrating across the 19th and 20th century, and they're still there today. And whether with the rise and fall of states and the shifts from east to west or north to south, those convictions are still very robust. And so I don't think that the 21st century is going to put up a kind of new reality where we will want to divest ourselves of those convictions and the implications they give us for how to think about international order.
Yeah, I'd say just really quickly that, partly it's the exhaustion, the bankruptcy, and the tyranny of all of the alternatives, right? And so, this is a rational state choice to pursue the liberal international order. And I want to underscore a message in John's book, and it's right behind him over his right shoulder. And it's a great book. You should buy it. It's called A World Safe for Democracy. And it's a world safe for democracy. The reason, that picture is St. Paul's Cathedral during the London Blitz, right? This was not something that was done because out of some purely idealistic notion. This was done because democracies have a self-interest in doing this. And it's about bringing security, and it's about allowing cooperation on practical problems while safeguarding national sovereignty and independence, but it allows them to actually get together to deal with not only military threats, but the transnational threats that basically continue to define our era while protecting, hopefully, their own internal liberties. So the logic remains, even if it's under assault.
Well, our time has ended, unfortunately, but I want to thank our three panelists for a very interesting and thought-provoking conversation today. And Courtney, I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, just to echo Joanna, thank you all. This was a really fascinating conversation, and I always get to enjoy being able to sit back and listen to it. Just as a reminder to everyone, if you want to join our discussion group, oh, well, first we have some events coming up. We have one on Monday with Stefan Selig, who was the former Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, and a couple of other events that we don't have a card up for right now, but just given the people that joined this conversation, and thank you all for joining. Weapons of mass destruction and climate change and global challenges came up quite frequently. We were having a conversation on February 1st with Rachel Bronson, who's the head of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And we'll be, yeah, so we'll be addressing a lot of those issues because their doomsday clock is coming out next week. And we also have one on February 18th with Richard Fontaine, and this is on an alliance of techno-democracies. So taking a look at alliances from another angle. If you do want to join our, yes, so we have RSVP for upcoming event, post-event discussion group. If you'd like to join, please click on that. I guess you have to scan the QR code, or there's a link that should be in the chat box right now. This is just 15 minutes, a chance to digest, because there are a lot of great questions that we weren't able to get to. And it's a great chance just to get to know some of the other people who are participating. And again, we're a nonprofit. We'd love to keep these briefings free and open to everyone around the world. So if you have the opportunity to donate, and we would really, really appreciate it. You can donate either through the QR code or on our website, and it will help us keep these briefings going. So again, really big thank you to all of the panelists. You're all amazing thinkers, and we're so honored that you could join us today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.